Hello and welcome back to Nightfall Lore. I am so glad you are here. Wherever you are right now, whatever the hour, whatever the weight of the day you are setting down as you settle in, I am glad you found your way here. Take a breath, get comfortable. There is a story waiting, and it is a good one, even though it is a sad one. These days on this channel, those tend to be the same thing. Tonight we're going to Elden Ring again, and we're going to talk about a man who learned to bend gravity around a star so that a small horse would not have to carry his weight. Let that sit for a moment, because I think that image, a demigod of terrifying power studying one of the most advanced magical disciplines in the world, not to conquer kingdoms or challenge gods, but so that a scrawny horse he loved would not struggle under him, that image contains everything you need to know about who Radahn was before the rot took him, before the wasteland, before the festival that was not a festival, before the stars came down. We talk a lot on this channel about the kinds of power that FromSoftware gives its characters. The power of the blade, the power of divine inheritance, the power of cosmic forces wielded by hands that were not built to contain them, and in Elden Ring specifically, the power of the great runes and the shattering and the demigod bloodlines and everything that flows from Marika's decision to break the world she made. But Radahn's most important act of power is not any of those things. His most important act of power is the decision to go to Celia and spend years learning gravity magic so that Leonard would not be left behind. That decision, made in obscurity, made for no audience, made for the most personal and the least strategically significant reason imaginable, is the foundation of everything that follows. The stopped stars, the vow, the battle of Aeonia, the festival, the rot, the wasteland. All of it grows from a young demigod who looked at his horse and decided that the horse mattered. By the time most players meet Radahn, he is already gone. What remains is enormous and terrible, and riding a tiny horse across the red sands of Caelid, consuming the bodies of the soldiers who once served him, because the hunger of the scarlet rot is the only thing still moving inside a mind that used to contain so much more. He does not know you. He does not know his soldiers. He does not know his horse, though the horse has stayed beside him through everything, faithful in the way that animals are faithful, without conditions or expectations or the need for the thing they love to still be capable of love in return. The Radahn Festival, which is what the game calls the event surrounding his boss fight, sounds like a celebration. It is not. It is a mercy killing dressed in the language of a war festival, because the people who organised it could not bear to call it what it was. The greatest warrior of the age, the man who halted the stars with his gravity magic and fought the most fearsome demigod alive to a standstill, had been reduced to something that needed to be put down, and his loyal soldiers, rather than simply abandon him, organised an event that would give him the most honourable death they could imagine. They called it a festival. They invited the greatest fighters in the lands between. They announced it with fanfare and spectacle and the pageantry of a war celebration. Because Radahn deserved that, he deserved to die the way he had lived, with witnesses, with honour, with understanding that what was being ended was not a monster but a man, and that the ending was an act of love. There is a specific kind of grief that is not expressed through weeping or silence or the ordinary languages of mourning. It is expressed through doing. Through the people who cannot simply sit with the loss but need to build something in response to it, to organise and plan and act, because action is the only thing that keeps the grief from becoming unbearable. Jeren and the Redmane Knights built a festival. Not because it would bring Radahn back, not because it would undo what Malenia had done or reverse the rot or restore the man who had stopped the stars, because it was something. because it honoured who he had been, even as it acknowledged who he had become, because the man who had taught them how to fight with honour deserved to receive an honourable death from the hands of fighters who understood what that meant. Tonight, we are going to tell Radahn's complete story, from the day he was born the son of two of the most powerful beings in the lands between, through the childhood that shaped him, and the horse that defined him, and the gravity magic that let him keep what he loved, through the war and the battle and the rot and the waiting, through the festival and the death and what came after, in a shadow realm where a dead man's soul was put into someone else's body and made into a god's consort. We're going to tell all of it. Get comfortable, close your eyes if you want to, and let me tell you about the man who stopped the stars for a small horse and a promise. Every hero has a beginning, and Radahn's beginning was more complicated than most. He was born the son of two extraordinary people, and the complications of that parentage would shape everything he became, from the colour of his hair to the wars he fought, to the fate that waited for him in the rot-filled wastes of Caelid. His mother was Queen Renala of the Full Moon, head of the Carian royal family, master of the Academy of Raya Lucaria, one of the greatest sorcerers who ever lived, a woman whose power over the moon and its magic was so absolute that she could rewrite the very laws of birth, reshaping her children from the foundations of their existence. Renala was brilliant and she was formidable, and she was, in the specific way that powerful people who have devoted themselves entirely to their work are sometimes difficult to love in ordinary ways, somewhat remote. Her academy was her world, her magic was her passion, and her children, Radahn and his siblings Rikard and Rani, grew up in the shadow of a mother who was magnificent and sometimes distant, and always, always impressive. His father was Radagon of the Golden Order, a champion of Erdtree and commander whose name was spoken with the same reverence as Godfrey's own, a man who had fought for the Golden Order with a ferocity and a brilliance that made him one of the most celebrated warriors in the history of the lands between. Radagon was red-haired, a detail that carried significance in the cosmology of this world, because red hair in the lands between was associated with the giants and their fell god, ancient enemies of the Golden Order who had once posed the most devastating threat to everything Radagon stood for. To have red hair was, in the context of that world, to carry a visible mark of the enemy, and Radagon hated his red hair for this reason, saw it as a curse, a sign of some taint in his lineage that he could not expunge no matter how faithfully he served the Erdtree. There is a profound irony in this, one that FromSoftware embedded deliberately. Radagon, the champion of the Golden Order, the man who fought all his life to embody its values and extend its reach, carried in his own appearance the mark of the thing he opposed. He could not escape it. He could not dye it away or cut it away or will it into something else. It was there, on his head, every time he looked in a mirror, a reminder that the purity he served was not a purity he possessed. This tension between what Radagon wanted to be and what his biology insisted he was would express itself differently in his son, because Radahn, inheriting the same red hair, looked at it and made a completely different choice. He left. This is the bare fact that the law delivers without softening. Radagon married Renala. They had 3 children together, and then Radagon left his wife and family to become Queen Marika's consort and the second Elden Lord. The marriage to Renala ended. The family it had produced, Radahn and Rikard and Rani, were suddenly the children of a broken home, the offspring of a man who had chosen an empire over the people who needed him. Renala did not handle this well. The great queen, the brilliant sorcerer, fell into a grief so profound that it effectively ended her reign. She retreated to the library of the academy, clutching a small golden sphere given to her by Radahn, and she sat there for what seems like years or decades, her students becoming increasingly disillusioned and eventually turning against her, while she rocked back and forth among the burned pages of her books and sang softly to herself and tried to reconstruct, through the magic of rebirth, some version of the children and the love that had been taken from her. The magic of rebirth became an obsession. She remade things endlessly, imperfect versions of impossible hopes, creatures that emerged from eggs and lived briefly and died or changed and were never quite right, because what she was trying to recreate could not be recreated, and the magic that could reshape flesh could not reshape grief, and the library of the academy became one of the saddest places in the lands between, filled with the evidence of a brilliant mind devoted entirely to a task that could not be completed. Into this fractured household Radahn was born, and what he made of it is the most revealing thing about his character. He did not inherit his father's self-loathing about the red hair. He looked at the mark that Radahn had always seen as a curse and decided it was something else entirely. The red hair of the giants, the colour that his father hated and tried to hide from himself, Radahn wore with deliberate pride. He called himself a lion. He adopted the lion motif that had once belonged to Godfrey, the warrior king he idolised above all others, and he folded the red mane into that identity. "I was born a champion's cub," the inscription on his helmet tells you. "Now I am the lord of the battlefield's lion." This is Radahn's essential act of self-creation. He took the thing that was supposed to shame him, the inheritance that his father treated as a curse, and he turned it into the centerpiece of his identity. The red hair was not a mark of the enemy. It was the mane of a lion. It was the colour of fire and war and the kind of courage that does not flinch from what it is. And the man who wore it was not his father's son in the ways that his father would have wished, not a servant of the Golden Order, not a devotee of the Erdtree's institutional hierarchy. He was something older and more primal, a warrior, a general, a lion. His admiration of Godfrey was genuine and deep. Godfrey had been Marika's first Elden Lord, the greatest warrior of his age, a man who fought with axes rather than magic, and led armies with the charisma and the physicality of someone who needed no divine sanction to make the people around him believe they could follow him anywhere. Godfrey was exiled eventually, stripped of his grace, sent from the lands between to wander as a tarnished, until some distant future in which Marika would call the tarnished back. But his legend endured, and Radahn, growing up in the complicated aftermath of his parents' marriage and divorce, found in Godfrey's example something simpler and truer than anything the political machinery of the Golden Order could offer. A warrior was what you were, not what institution you served. Strength was earned, not granted, and a lion wore its mane without apology. His admiration of Godfrey was genuine and deep. Godfrey had been Marika's first Elden Lord, the greatest warrior of his age, a man who fought with axes rather than magic, and led armies with the charisma and physicality of someone who needed no divine sanction to make the people around him believe they could follow him anywhere. Godfrey was exiled eventually, stripped of his grace, sent from the lands between to wander as a tarnished. But his legend endured, and Radahn, growing up in the complicated aftermath of his parents' marriage and divorce, found in Godfrey's example something simpler and truer than anything the political machinery of the Golden Order could offer. A warrior was what you were, not what institution you served. Strength was earned, not granted. A lion wore its mane without apology. But to fully understand what Radahn's act of self-creation meant, you have to understand what he was doing it against. Not just his father's legacy, his mother's grief. Rennala, after Radahn left, was not the powerful Carian queen the world had known. She was a woman in the full catastrophe of heartbreak, and the catastrophe was happening in front of her children. They watched their mother fold in on herself. They watched the brilliant sorcerer retreat to the library with a golden sphere and stop being present in any meaningful way. They watched the students grow disillusioned, and they were children. Radahn and Ricard and Ranni were children watching their family come apart, and each of them responded in ways that told you exactly who they were going to become. Ricard descended into nihilism and eventually merged with the serpent god. Ranni rejected her fate entirely and cut her ties to the divine rather than inherit a destiny she did not choose, and Radahn made a horse his best friend and decided his hair was beautiful and studied gravity magic and became, in the fullest possible sense, himself. The circumstances that crushed his mother and embittered his siblings were the same circumstances that forged him into the Red Lion. Not by denying the pain, by refusing to be defined by it. This is the boy who had become the Starscourge, before the gravity magic, before the war, before the rot. Just a red-haired child in a fractured family, looking at his father's most hated quality and deciding it was the best thing about himself. Before we talk about what Radahn became, before the wars and the gravity and the stars and the scarlet rot, we need to talk about the horse. Because the horse is the story. Not the whole story, but the heart of it. The part that, once you understand it, changes everything else. The part that makes the warrior into a person and the legend into a man. His name was Leonard, a scrawny, undersized horse who should by all rights have been completely unsuitable for a demigod warrior of Radahn's eventual scale. Leonard was not a warhorse in any conventional sense. He was not large. He was not particularly imposing. He was, by multiple accounts in the game's lore, beloved and small, the kind of horse that a normal-sized knight might ride without anyone raising an eyebrow, but that became increasingly, almost comically inadequate as his rider grew to the size of a small building. Radahn grew enormous. This is the nature of demigod children in Elden Ring. The power that flows through their bloodlines expresses itself physically, stretching the body to accommodate the energy inside it. Radahn became one of the largest beings in the lands between, a giant of a man who would have made most horses disappear under his weight like a tent stake driven into soft ground. The math was obvious. The sensible thing was to find a different horse, a larger horse, a horse that could actually carry a demigod without being crushed into the dirt. Radahn refused. He refused not because he was stubborn or unreasonable or indifferent to Leonard's suffering. He refused because he loved the horse, and he was not willing to leave him behind. The item description for Radahn's Great Rune tells you why in a single sentence. The Red Lion General wielded gravitational powers which he learned in Celia during his younger days. Also, he would never have to abandon his beloved but scrawny steed. Read that again. He learned gravity magic all so he would never have to abandon his beloved but scrawny steed. Not for war, not for glory, not to challenge the stars or win the Shattering or claim the throne of the Elden Lord. He learned one of the most advanced magical disciplines in the history of the land between because he wanted to keep riding his horse. Because Leonard mattered to him more than the inconvenience of years of dedicated study in an obscure branch of sorcery. Because the idea of leaving his horse behind was more unacceptable, than the difficulty of mastering the magic that would prevent it. Radahn travelled to Celia, a town of sorcery in Caelid, to find a teacher. His teacher was an alabaster lord, a being from Aeonia who possessed deep knowledge of gravitational magic. He studied under this figure with the same dedication he brought to everything else in his life, which is to say absolute and complete dedication, the kind that leaves no room for half measures or acceptable proxies. Think about what this required. Radahn, who studied the most advanced sorcery of his era and became one of the greatest mages in the lands between, was Radahn's father. The capacity for deep magical learning was in the bloodline. But Radahn was not primarily a sorcerer, he was a warrior. His instincts and his training and his identity were organised around the physical, around the blade and the body and the confrontation that happens at arm's length. He had to step outside that identity to go to Celia. He had to sit in a room with an alabaster lord and learn to think in terms of invisible forces and the manipulation of things that do not have a physical form. He had to become, for the duration of his studies, something other than what he was, in order to return to being exactly what he was. And he did it. Not because it was easy or natural, because Leonard needed him to. The item description for Radahn's great rune says it with a simplicity that is devastating in its matter-of-factness. Also, he would never have to abandon his beloved but scrawny steed. All of it. The years of study, the alien discipline of gravitational sorcery, the time spent away from the physical martial world that was his natural domain. All of it, so that one specific horse would never have to carry more than it was able to carry. He mastered the magic. He learned to make himself functionally weightless, to manipulate the gravitational pull around his own body so that whatever he sat on felt almost nothing. And then he went back to Leonard and climbed on his horse and rode him, and Leonard, who had no idea what any of this meant and had simply been waiting, carried him like it was nothing. This is what the gravity magic was for. All of it. The Starscourge title, the ability to arrest the movement of celestial bodies, the power that made him one of the most feared figures in the lands between. It began as a way to keep riding a small horse. The same power that would eventually stop the stars was first developed and refined and perfected, because Radahn refused to imagine a future in which he and Leonard were separated. Think about what this tells you about the hierarchy of Radahn's values. He was a demigod. He had access to resources and teachers and magical traditions that most people could never approach. He could have studied the most prestigious and militarily advantageous disciplines available to a warrior of his lineage. He chose gravity magic, specifically because of a horse, and then he mastered it so thoroughly that it became the most defining feature of his identity. The greatest military tool he ever possessed was something he developed for entirely personal reasons. There is also something in this that speaks to the relationship between love and mastery. Radahn did not learn gravity magic well enough to manage Leonard's weight. He mastered it. He took it far enough to arrest the movement of stars. The love that motivated the learning did not cap out at the immediate practical need. It drove him past that need, past the point where the immediate problem was solved, into a depth of understanding that transformed the tool into something far more powerful than what it was originally meant to be. This is the pattern of people who do things for love rather than for ambition. Ambition learns enough. Love keeps going. There is a term in psychology for the way a person's first and deepest loves shape the patterns of everything that follows. Attachment, the specific form of bonding that establishes the template for how someone relates to the world. Radahn's attachment to Leonard was the template for everything. The fierce, unconditional loyalty, the refusal to abandon what he loved even when logic or convenience suggested abandonment would be easier, the willingness to sacrifice enormous personal resources, years of study, the kind of effort that most people would redirect towards something with more obvious strategic value, in service of a commitment that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with love. By the time you encounter Radahn in the Wailing Dunes, Leonard is still there. After the battle with Malenia, after the rot consumed Caelid, after Radahn's mind deteriorated and his identity eroded, and the general became the feral thing that wanders the battlefield consuming soldiers, Leonard is still there, scrawny, withered, probably also infected with the scarlet rot that has soaked into every living thing in Caelid, still carrying his lord, still beside him, two beings who were supposed to have abandoned each other years ago, still together, because one of them learned gravity magic so the other would not have to be left behind. There is a word for what Leonard demonstrates in staying. It is not loyalty in the conscious, deliberate sense. Animals do not deliberate. But it is loyalty in the truest sense, which is not about deliberation at all. It is about the shape of the world as organized around a specific center. Leonard's world has always been organized around Radahn, not around comfort or safety or the ordinary animal drives of food and shelter, and the avoidance of pain around Radahn. And even when the Radahn that Leonard is moving through the world beside is not the Radahn he chose, even when the centre of his world is now something that no longer knows him, the orientation persists. The world is still organised the same way. He is still here. Radahn is still there. They are still moving together. The gravity magic is still working. This is the final detail that makes the wasteland image so unbearable to sit with. Radahn made himself weightless for Leonard. He learned the magic. He kept it active. And even in the rot and the madness, even in the thing that the Shattering and the Battle of Aeonia and the Scarlet Rot made of him, the gravity magic is still working. Leonard is still not carrying the full weight of what Radahn is, because the body still knows what it was taught to do and has not been told to stop. There is no one left to appreciate this. There is no conscious Radahn to reflect on the fact that the magic he learned for love is still, automatically, lovingly, doing the thing he taught it to do. There is only the dunes and the hunger, and the horse beneath the hunger, still not carrying the full weight, still being cared for in the only way that the body can still care for anything. The person is gone. The care remains. FromSoftware labelled Radahn's character model in the game files as Radahn and Leonard, not Radahn. Radahn and Leonard. The developers understood what the relationship was. They understood that the warrior and the horse were a single thing, that the story of one could not be told without the story of the other. There was no Radahn without Leonard. There was no Leonard without Radahn. They were not two characters sharing a model. They were one story in two bodies, and when Radahn falls in the Wailing Dunes, when the Tarnished's final blow lands and the enormous body collapses to the red sand, Leonard disappears, not into the fight, not into the distance. He simply is not there anymore. The game does not tell you where he goes. Some players believe he finally rests, having completed the only purpose he had after everything else was taken, which was to carry Radahn to the end. Whatever the truth, the game removes him from the world at the same moment it removes Radahn, and this synchronicity is the most honest statement the game makes about what they were to each other, together, always, until the last moment. There is something worth saying here about what Leonard represents in the larger architecture of Elden Ring's themes. Elden Ring is a game about legacy and inheritance and the weight of who your parents were and what their choices made of the world you were born into. Almost every major character in the game is defined by their relationship to a parent or a divine progenitor or an institutional inheritance they did not choose. Ranni rejects her fate. Malenia is consumed by hers. Miquella tries to transcend his. Ricard descends into his most destructive impulse. And Radahn, who grew up with a father who hated his own hair and a mother who fell apart when that father left, looked at everything he had inherited and made a different kind of choice. He chose Leonard, a small horse with no significance to any of the cosmological dramas playing out around him. Not a divine gift, not a symbol of lineage or power or cosmic destiny, just a horse, Radahn's horse, something he had chosen for himself, outside the structures of inheritance and obligation, and the demands of gods and vows and the Golden Order's endless appetite for conformity. Leonard was the one thing in Radahn's life that was completely and simply his, chosen by no one but him for no reason but love, and he defended that choice with every ounce of the power that everything else in his life had tried to claim for grander purposes. This is why the gravity magic for Leonard hits differently than the gravity magic for the stars. The stopped stars are magnificent and cosmic and the kind of achievement that gets written into history. The learned weightlessness, the years of study so a small horse would not struggle. That is the achievement that tells you who Radahn actually was when no one was watching. To understand what Radahn became, you need to understand what the stars mean in Elden Ring. Not in the astronomical sense, not as distant suns burning the void of space, but in the cosmological sense, as they function within the specific framework of this world's metaphysics. Because in the lands between, the stars are not merely luminous objects in the night sky. They are forces. They have meanings. Their positions and their movements are connected through mechanisms the game does not fully explain but strongly implies to the destinies of the people born beneath them. The stars are fate, or something close enough to fate that the distinction is largely academic. When Ranni says that she needs the stars to move again, when the lore tells you that Radahn's death is required for a certain path to become available, it is because Radahn arrested the movement of the stars, and in doing so, arrested the movement of destiny itself. Certain things could not happen while the stars were frozen. Certain people could not fulfill their purposes. The world was not stuck in time exactly, but the mechanisms that were supposed to carry certain events forward had been jammed, locked in place by a gravity so immense that the cosmos itself could not move past it. Radahn stopped the stars. This is one of the most extraordinary things any character in the game is said to have accomplished, and it is presented with the understated matter-of-factness that FromSoftware uses for all of its most dramatic lore revelations. You read it in an item description. You might easily miss it. A character in a sorcery school mentions it in passing, and what they are passing over, as if it were simply a fact about the world rather than an act of staggering power, is that one man used gravity magic to arrest the movement of celestial bodies and hold them fixed in the sky for what appears to be years or decades. Why did he do it? The game gives you the answer in fragments that require assembly. Radahn had a vow with Miquella. The specifics of the vow are never fully stated, but the DLC's item descriptions and dialogue fill in the outline. Miquella said that if Radahn upheld his vow, they would rule together in a world of peace. Radahn upheld his side by stopping the stars, which halted Miquella's destiny, presumably buying Miquella the time he needed to complete his plans without the interference of a fate he did not choose. Consider what this vow meant to Radahn specifically. He was the son of Radagon and Rennala, a child whose family had been broken by his father's choice to serve the Golden Order over the people who needed him. He had watched his mother fall apart. He had watched the world of his childhood dismantled by forces that had no interest in what the dismantling cost. And then the Shattering came, and the war came, and Caelid became a battlefield, and the people Radahn commanded died, and the land around him burned, and the whole vast machinery of demigod politics ground through everything he had built. A man who had lived through all of this would hear the words "a world of peace" and feel something specific. Not skepticism, not cynicism, hope. The exhausted, hard-won hope of someone who has spent their life in the middle of everything that a world without peace produces, and who believes, with every part of themselves, that the alternative is possible and worth working toward. Miquella understood this. He understood it because he shared it. He too was a child of a broken divine family. He too had watched his twin sister ravaged by a curse. He too had seen what the Shattering produced. The vow between them was not a political arrangement, it was a recognition. Two people who wanted the same thing, coming from different directions, making a promise to each other that the world they both needed could exist if they both worked to make it. The stopped stars were Radahn's contribution to that promise, holding the future in place until the conditions were right, bearing the weight of arrested time with the same patient, absolute commitment that he brought to everything else. Radahn used gravity to hold on to things. That is who he was. The title Starscourge was given to him after this achievement. It is not a gentle name. Scourge implies something destructive, something that afflicts rather than blesses. But in this context, it means something more specific. He was the scourge of the stars in the sense of being their subduer, the force that brought them to heel. He did not destroy them. He captured them. He held them where they were, as fixed and immovable as everything else he refused to let go. He was studying in Celia when he accomplished this, the town of sorcery in Caelid, where he had gone to learn gravity magic from his Alabaster Lord teacher. He was still a young man, still growing into the physical enormity that would eventually make him the largest demigod in the lands between. And from this town of scholars and sorcerers, he reached up through his magic and closed his hands around the stars and held them. The implications of this act ripple through the entire game in ways that most players do not fully appreciate on a first playthrough. The stars being stopped meant that certain destinies were also stopped. Ranni's plan required the stars to move. The opening of Nokron required the stars to move. Miquella's own destiny, whatever it was supposed to be, was arrested by Radahn's gravity. In halting the stars, Radahn effectively put the future on pause. He created a period of cosmic suspension in which certain things that were supposed to happen could not happen, and certain people who were supposed to become something were held in a kind of becoming, waiting for the moment when the stars would move again and the future could resume. Who benefited from this and who was harmed by it is a question that does not have a clean answer. Ranni needed the stars to move to fulfill her plan, so the stopped stars delayed her. But if Miquella's destiny involved something Radahn did not want to see happen, then the stopped stars were also protection. The gravity magic was not a neutral act. It was a position, a stance. Radahn looked at the map of the future as it was written in the sky, and he decided, for reasons that connected to his vow with Miquella, that the future needed to wait, and he held it there, with his hands, for years. The gravity magic and the stopped stars are the most dramatic expressions of Radahn's power, but they are not the whole story of who he was as a warrior and a leader. Because before the rot, and before the festival, and before the wasteland, Radahn was a general A real general, in the fullest sense of the word, not just a powerful individual who happened to be at the front of an army, but a commander who understood tactics and strategy and the human element of warfare, who inspired loyalty in his soldiers that endured even after the man they had pledged themselves to was no longer capable of recognizing their faces. The Redmane Knights were his, not assigned to him, not commanded to serve him by some higher authority. His. They chose him. The red-armoured warriors who populate Redmane Castle, who still man the battlements and organise the festival in his name years after the Battle of Aeonia, are there because Radahn was the kind of leader who inspired the kind of loyalty that does not dissipate when the object of that loyalty is no longer capable of returning it. They stayed not because they were obligated to stay. They stayed because leaving would have meant abandoning the man who had made them what they were. This is rare. Most lords in the lands between inspire obedience rather than loyalty, service born of fear or obligation or the calculation of self-interest. Radahn inspired something different. The soldiers who kept fires burning in the Caelid wastes after the rot spread, holding off the corruption with flame, staying in the most hostile environment in the lands between because their general was still there even in the wreckage of himself. Those soldiers were not following orders, they were honouring a relationship. They were the military version of a Leonard, remaining beside something they loved long after the practical case for remaining had evaporated. What made Radahn this kind of leader is embedded in the details of his character that the game offers in fragments. He was intelligent, not just in the martial sense but in the sorceress sense, capable of learning and mastering complex magical disciplines that most warriors would never attempt. He was educated, having studied in formal academic settings rather than purely through the trial and error of battle. He was competitive in the way that drives excellence rather than cruelty, forming what his lore describes as a competitive yet friendly rivalry with Gaius, the Albinoric he befriended while studying under the Alabaster Lord. He befriended Gaius. This detail is easy to overlook, but it is telling. Gaius was an Albinoric, a being created artificially from human flesh and blood, not a demigod or a noble, or a person whose company would have carried any social advantage for Radahn. The friendship happened because Radahn liked Gaius, found him a worthy rival, enjoyed the competition between them. The lore also tells us that Radahn's half-brother Mesmer, the Impaler, was friends with Gaius too, and that the two became as elder brothers to Radahn. Radahn, the son of the broken marriage, the child who grew up watching his mother fall apart and his father disappear into a new divine family, formed his own family in Celia, not out of obligation or strategy, out of the simple human impulse to find people worth knowing and hold on to them. This is the pattern, the same pattern, always. Radahn found things worth holding on to, and he held them. A horse, a vow, a friendship formed in a town of sorcerers while he was learning to make himself weightless. An army of knights who believed in him so thoroughly that they stayed in a poisoned wasteland for years after he could no longer know they were there. He was, at every level and in every context, a person who refused to let go of the things he valued. And this quality, this particular form of loyalty, that was also a form of love, was what made him the greatest and the most heartbreaking figure in Elden Ring's enormous cast of extraordinary and heartbreaking figures. He was also humble in a specific way, not self-deprecating, not doubtful of his own abilities, but humble in the sense that he never seemed to believe his power made him exceptional as a person. His power was just power. What he was as a person was something he had to earn through his choices, through the consistency of his character, through the specifics of how he treated the people around him, and what he was willing to sacrifice for them. The gravity magic for Leonard, the stopped stars for Miquella. The festival that his soldiers organised for him was their way of giving back a version of what he had always given them, the commitment to see things through to their honourable end regardless of the cost. There is a moment in the Radahn fight that is entirely optional and entirely wonderful. You can summon Patches into the battle, Patches who is everywhere in FromSoftware games, who is always a coward and always a rogue and always motivated purely by self-interest, will appear in the arena and then almost immediately abandon the fight when things get dangerous. He runs away. And this is somehow exactly right, because the fight against Radahn is a fight about loyalty and honour and the commitment to see difficult things through to the end, and Patches represents the opposite of all of those things, and his presence and his cowardice make the soldiers who stayed, the Iron Fist Alexander and the Blade and the others who fight beside you and die repeatedly and are summoned again and keep coming back, make them more meaningful by contrast. Patches runs, the soldiers come back. This single contrast is worth more than a paragraph of explanation about what Radahn built and what it meant. The soldiers come back because Radahn taught them, by the consistency of his own example, that the things that matter are worth dying for more than once. Not through speeches, not through inspiring proclamations about duty and honour, through the way he lived, through the gravity magic for the horse, through the stopped stars for the vow, through the willingness to face Malenia directly on the red sands without retreat. You cannot lead people to this level of devotion through commands. You can only model it. Radahn modelled it every day in every choice, and the soldiers absorbed the model and became the kind of people who would die in an arena for a dead general's honour and then get up and come back and die again. Radahn built something real in Caelid, something that endured past the point where endurance made any practical sense. And that endurance, that refusal of his people to let the story end badly for him, is the context for everything that comes next. The war, the battle, the rot, the festival. If you're still with me tonight, if the story is doing what I hope it is doing and carrying you gently toward wherever you need to go, take a moment and subscribe to Nightfall Lore if you have not already. Leave a like if the telling is moving you. It means more than you know. Now settle back in. The war is about to begin. To understand what happened to Radahn, you need to understand the war that destroyed the world he lived in. Not a war between nations or ideologies or competing religions. A war between siblings. A war born from a moment of divine despair, when the god who had made everything decided that what she had made was not what she wanted anymore and broke it. Queen Marika the Eternal was the ruler of the lands between. Her Elden Ring, the fundamental law of the world, governed the reality of everything from the nature of death to the growth of crops to the specific form that grace took as it moved through the land. She was, in the most literal sense possible, the operating system of the world, and she shattered it. She took the Elden Ring and she broke it. We do not know exactly why. The game offers fragments and implications, and the sense of a mind driven past its limits by grief and loss, and the accumulating weight of something that could not be sustained. The death of her son Godwyn, the first of the demigods to fall, and the one whose murder seems to have broken something fundamental in the divine order, is connected to whatever pushed Marika over the edge. We know that she struck the Elden Ring with Malekith's sword, the weapon that contained the rune of death. We know that the act was deliberate. We know that the shattering that followed was catastrophic in ways that she must have anticipated. We do not know if she cared. We do not know if the caring had already been burned out of her by whatever preceded that moment. What we know is what she did, and what she did changed everything. When the Elden Ring shattered, its fragments flew to the demigods. Each of them received a great rune, a shard of the shattered lore, and the shards drove them mad. This is the game's explicit description of what happened. The runes corrupted the demigods, filled them with a maddening ambition, and sent them to war with each other over the question of who would inherit what their mother had broken. The Shattering was not a war of conquest in the traditional sense. It was a war of inheritance conducted by people who had been driven insane by what they had inherited. Radahn fought in the Shattering. He had to. The choice not to fight was not a real choice in a world where every other demigod was fighting. He fought from Redmane Castle in the Caelid wilds, leading his Redmane knights in a campaign that the game describes as extensive and fearsome. He tried to challenge Godric the Grafted in Limgrave. Godric, whose cowardice was only matched by his desperation, retreated behind the walls of Stormvale Castle and refused to come out. This tells you something about how the other demigods viewed Radahn. Even a fighter as self-aggrandizing and brutal as Godric did not want to face him in open battle. He also fought Margit. The game files and lore descriptions confirm that General Radahn and his foot soldiers engaged Margit, the Fell Omen, in an undisclosed battle of the Shattering. Margit, who serves as the gate to the game's first major area, and who is powerful enough to kill most players dozens of times before they overcome him, was another combatant in the war that Radahn moved through. The Shattering was not a clean conflict between a small number of named demigods. It was a sprawling, world-consuming war, and Radahn was in the middle of it, fighting everyone, winning most of it, defined by the same qualities that defined him in everything else: directness, power, the refusal to back away from a fight because the fight was difficult. But Radahn could not take Leyndell, the capital of the lands between, the seat of the Golden Order's power, the place that any would-be Elden Lord needed to occupy to claim legitimacy. He fought for it. The game does not tell you exactly how those battles went, but it tells you the outcome. He did not take it. And as the Shattering ground on and the war narrowed from a general conflict among all the demigods to a smaller and more brutal set of confrontations between those who remained standing, Radahn found himself facing an opponent unlike any he had fought before. Malenia arrived in Caelid, the Blade of Miquella, the greatest warrior of the age, the woman who had never been defeated in all the wars of the Shattering, who walked into Radahn's territory with the deliberate, unhurried confidence of someone who had already won every fight they had ever been in. She was there at her brother Miquella's direction. The lore suggests that Miquella needed Radahn dead, needed his soul freed so that it could be brought to the Land of Shadow and resurrected as the consort Miquella had always intended Radahn to be. The battle was not random, it was planned. Malenia was sent, and Radahn met her, not because he had no choice, but because he was Radahn, the Red Lion General. He met her the way he met everything, directly, without flinching. On the red sands of Caelid, with his twin greatswords in his hands and Leonard beneath him, facing the finest blade in the lands between, knowing that even his extraordinary power might not be enough. The battle between Radahn and Malenia is one of the most discussed events in Elden Ring's lore, not because the game shows it to you in full, though a cinematic trailer gives you fragments, not because the outcome is ambiguous, though the interpretation of that outcome is deeply complex. It is discussed because of what it cost, what both of them paid, what the landscape around them paid, and what was whispered into a dying man's ear when it was over. They fought to a standstill. This is the most important fact about the Battle of Aeonia. Malenia, who'd never been defeated in all the wars of the Shattering, could not defeat Radahn. And Radahn, whose power was so immense that even the strongest demigods avoided direct confrontation with him, could not defeat Malenia. Two of the most extraordinary warriors in the history of the lands between met in Caelid and fought each other to absolute exhaustion, to the point where neither of them could continue, to the point where the word defeat became meaningless because both of them had been destroyed by the encounter. This standstill deserves more attention than it typically receives in discussions of the battle. Malenia is often described in the game as having never been defeated. This is her legend, the Blade of Miquella, undefeated, the greatest warrior of the age. And yet the Battle of Aeonia did not produce a victory for her. She could not put Radahn down. She fought him with everything she had, including the scarlet rot that is her most devastating weapon, and the one thing that gave her a structural advantage over any opponent who did not share her immunity to it, and she could not kill him. What this tells you about Radahn is extraordinary. He fought someone who'd never lost to a draw, the only person in the lands between whose fighting ability was comparable to his in any measure, the person specifically sent by Miquella, because no one else could reliably face him and survive, and he held that person to a standstill. He did not win, but neither did she, and in a war where everyone else had either avoided fighting him directly or suffered obvious defeat, this is remarkable. The standstill is not a loss. In context, it is the closest thing to a victory that Malenia ever experienced in the entire Shattering, because she was the only one who came away without having obviously failed. And for Radahn, it is proof that at his peak, at the moment before the rot consumed him, he was exactly what the legend said he was, the mightiest demigod of his age. Malenia made a choice in that moment. She unleashed her scarlet rot deliberately. She allowed the curse she'd been carrying inside her since birth to bloom, outward in its most devastating form, releasing the rot in a catastrophic flowering that transformed the landscape of Caelid and infected everything within its radius, including and especially Radahn. This was not a desperate last resort. The young lion's armor description reveals something extraordinary. When Malenia let the rot flower blossom in Aeonia, Radahn heard a murmur in his ear. "Miquella awaits thee, O promised consort," she whispered to him. In the moment of the rot's release, in the instant before the corruption began to consume him, Malenia leaned close and told him what this had always been about. Not a battle over territory or pride or the simple survival imperative of the Shattering. A plan. Miquella's plan. The battle was arranged so that Radahn would die or be rendered so thoroughly broken that his soul could be claimed, and then his soul would be taken to the land of shadow and placed in a new vessel and made into the consort that Miquella needed to achieve godhood. Consider the intimacy of that whisper. They had been fighting to the absolute limit of what either of them could do. Two of the most powerful beings in the world had been destroying each other and the landscape around them for what must have been hours, pushing past pain and exhaustion and every human threshold, and the battle had ended not in victory but in mutual ruin. And in that moment of shared devastation, Malenia leaned close and spoke, not a battle cry, a whisper. "Miquella awaits thee, O promised consort." Whether those words were meant as comfort or as information, or as the fulfillment of an obligation to tell him what was happening, we cannot know. Whether Radahn, in that moment with the rot beginning its work and his body failing around him, had the capacity to understand what was being told to him, we cannot know. What we know is that someone thought it was important enough to say, and what was said was not your sacrifice is not wasted, or you will be honoured or thank you. What was said was that Miquella was waiting, as if this had always been a journey rather than a death, as if the Battle of Aeonia was not an ending but a transit. The question of whether Radahn knew, whether the vow between them, the one that made him stop the stars, included this, whether he consented to what was being done to him in that moment. This is the debate the community has been having since the DLC, and it is a debate worth having, and we will return to it. For now, what matters is what happened next. The rot consumed Caelid, not slowly. The scarlet Aeonia bloomed with the force of a weapon deliberately discharged, and what it produced was one of the most hostile environments in the entire game. The red sands, the perpetual sickness in the air, the creatures twisted by the rot, the remains of an army still fighting or wandering or burning fires against the encroachment of the disease that was everywhere. Caelid became what you find when you first enter it, a wasteland of such oppressive hostility that the game essentially warns you not to go there early, because the atmosphere alone communicates that something very wrong happened here, and the wrongness has not finished expressing itself, and Radahn was still alive. This is the part that makes the story a tragedy rather than just a defeat. Malenia's rot was devastating enough to end kingdoms and transform landscapes. It was not enough to kill Radahn. His body, enormous and powerful beyond the normal scale of even demigod endurance, survived the rot the way a tree survives a fire, damaged, hollowed, stripped of most of what made it vital, but standing. The rot ate his mind from the inside, consuming his identity and his memories and his sense of self with the patient, methodical destruction of an organism that existed to consume. But it could not kill the body that housed all of this. What remained was enormous and terrible and still riding Leonard. Still, after everything, on the horse, wandering the wailing dunes, consuming the bodies of the soldiers who had once been his, no longer knowing who they were or who he was or what any of it meant, driven by the hunger of the rot and the ghost of fighting reflexes so deeply written into his body that not even the destruction of his mind could erase them. Malenia walked away from the Battle of Aeonia and entered a coma in the place that would become the Lake of Rot, waiting to recover. She did not see what she had done to Caelid. She did not watch the land turn red. She did not see Radahn in his final state, the thing that the rot made of the man she'd fought to a standstill. But Leonard saw it. Leonard stayed. Let us stay in Caelid for a while. Let us not rush past the years between the Battle of Aeonia and the Radahn Festival, because those years are the part of the story that hurts the most. Not the battle, not the death, the waiting, the soldiers keeping their fires lit. Leonard remaining beside something that had forgotten his name. The festival that had to be organised because no one could simply let it end the way it was ending. The scarlet rot is one of the most distinctive and disturbing elements of Elden Ring's world building. It is everywhere in Caelid, in the soil and the water and the air, a ubiquitous biological presence that transforms everything it inhabits into a version of itself. Animals become rot-filled and aggressive. Plants become bulbous and diseased. The landscape itself takes on the qualities of infection, red and swollen and wrong, in ways that the eye registers before the mind has time to identify the specific problem. What the rot does to a person's mind is what makes it particularly relevant to Radahn's story. It does not simply damage cognitive function, it corrupts it. It replaces the person's own desires and memories and identity with a hunger, a single overwhelming drive to consume and spread. The person does not disappear immediately, they deteriorate. There are stages in which the person is still present enough to be aware of what is happening to them, aware that the self they spent their life building is being dismantled from the inside by something that cannot be reasoned with or fought or cured, and then eventually the person is gone and only the hunger remains. This process happened to Radahn over a period of time the game does not specify, but that was clearly extensive. The soldiers who remained in Caelid did not immediately begin organising a festival. They stayed and watched and tended what they could tend and kept their fires burning because the fires were something they could do. A practical gesture of loyalty and resistance against the Rot's relentless advance. And they watched their general deteriorate, watched the man who had stopped the stars become a creature that did not know where it was or why. Watched Leonard carry him across the dunes, the horse presumably also infected, both of them consumed by the same rot in different degrees, both of them somehow still together. There is something particularly cruel about what the rot did to Radahn specifically. He was a man of extraordinary intelligence and discipline. The gravity magic required years of dedicated study. The stopped stars required sustained concentration that most people could not maintain for a day, let alone years. His mind was one of his most important weapons, possibly more important than the twin greatswords or the immense physical power. And the rot went for the mind first. It finds the thing that makes a person who they are, and it begins there. In Radahn's case, that thing was the person, the interior life, the capacity for the specific choices that defined him, the horse, the vow, the honour. The rot could not touch any of this directly, but it could take the mind that held all of it, and without the mind, the horse and the vow, and the honour ceased to exist in any meaningful sense. What remained was the shape of a great warrior without the content. The enormous body still moved with residual reflexes of decades of combat training. But the person who had decided to master gravity magic for a horse was gone. The hunger that replaced him had no interest in horses. The decision to organise the Radahn festival was not made because the soldiers thought there was hope for recovery. It was made because they understood that what was happening to him was an ongoing torment, that the rot was keeping him alive in a state no person with dignity would choose for themselves, and that the most loving thing they could do for the general who had given everything to them was to give him what he could not give himself. The soldiers who remained were Radahn's most devoted people, not the ones who served him out of obligation or proximity. The ones who chose to stay after the battle, after the rot, after any reasonable assessment of the situation, would have concluded that their service was no longer meaningful in any practical sense. They stayed because Radahn had been the kind of leader who inspired exactly this kind of loyalty, the irrational, deeply human refusal to leave someone behind just because leaving would be easier. Think about what it actually meant to remain in Caelid during this period. Caelid after the Battle of Aeonia was not a place that any rational person would choose to inhabit. The rot was in the air. The water was contaminated. The wildlife had been transformed into aggressive, diseased versions of itself. The terrain was hostile in ways that went beyond ordinary danger, suffused with an ambient wrongness that the game communicates through its atmosphere alone, the red haze, the twisted trees, the specific quality of unpleasantness that makes first-time players turn around and come back later when they are stronger. And the soldiers chose to stay in this, chose to maintain their fires against the rot, chose to continue calling themselves Radahn's people, even after Radahn no longer knew they existed. The lore mentions survivors of Radahn's army still in the wilds, staving off the rot with fire against rot. The most primal defensive tool humans have, held up against the most comprehensive biological corruption in the game's world. Not winning, not reversing the damage, just maintaining a perimeter of light in the dark, keeping the fires burning because keeping the fires burning was what they could do, and doing something was better than abandoning the man they had served. This is what great leadership produces. Not obedience, devotion. The willingness to stay in a poisoned wasteland and keep a fire burning for someone who can no longer see the fire or know you are there. Radahn did not ask them to do this. He could not ask. But they knew, in the way that people who've been deeply known by someone carry the knowledge of what that person would have wanted, that he would not have left them. So they did not leave him. A death worthy of his life. The item description for the Starscourge Greatsword says it plainly. Festering with rot and crippled by madness, all he wanted was an honourable death. Jeren, the Castellan of Redmane Castle, knew Radahn well enough to speak for him. His words when the festival concludes carry the specific exhaustion of someone who has completed the most difficult task of their life. Finally, my work is done. I am no longer bound to this fortress. The festival they created was a masterpiece of loyal grief. They could not simply find an assassin. They could not simply close the gates and let the rot finish its work. Both of those options would have been practical, and neither would have been worthy. They organised a war festival. They invited the greatest warriors in the lands between. They framed the encounter as a celebration, and in doing so they gave Radahn something the rot could not take away. The context of a warrior's death, the witnesses that a life like his deserved. Iron Fist Alexander was there. The pot warrior rolling toward the dunes with the cheerful determination of someone who had decided that fighting the greatest warrior of the age was exactly the kind of thing worth travelling a great distance for. Bled was there, the half-wolf knight whose loyalty to Ranni had brought him to a festival connected to everything Ranni needed. Patches was there, briefly, before his self-preservation instinct reasserted itself, and the Tarnished was there, the player character, the decisive element in a coordinated effort by multiple fighters to bring down something too large and too powerful for any single person to handle alone. The Radahn Festival is one of the most memorable boss encounters in any FromSoftware game, and what makes it memorable is not primarily the difficulty or the spectacle, though both are considerable. It is the emotional architecture, the way the game constructs the context for the fight, so that by the time you descend the elevator to the Wailing Dunes, you understand exactly what you are doing and what it costs. The approach through Redmane Castle is a masterclass in tone. The soldiers you pass are celebrating, or performing celebration, or doing the thing you do when you love someone and you want the last thing done for them to feel like love rather than loss, which is to dress the grief in the language of festivity and stand very straight and keep your voice steady when you announce the general's name. They call it a celebration of war. They say General Radahn is surely pleased. They clap and they cheer, and they say the thing said at a festival, and underneath every word is the specific grief of people who know exactly what is about to happen and have decided that making it ceremonial is the best way they know to honour it. There is a quality to the soldiers' cheering that is different from ordinary crowd noise. They're not cheering for a victory. They are cheering for something they have been building toward for years, something they could not do sooner because sooner would not have been worthy. They needed someone like you, not someone strong enough to win, someone strong enough to be worth it. The festival could not be held for a fighter who would die in the first minute and leave Radahn standing alone in the dunes, robbed even of the context of a worthy death. It needed to be held for a challenger who could meet him as an equal, who could give him the fight his life had been building toward, who could end it in a way that felt like completion rather than extinguishment. This is what Jeren was waiting for. This is why the festival could not be held earlier. Not the difficulty, the worthiness. Jeren delivers the announcement with the practiced cadence of someone who has been preparing for this moment for a long time. His words are formal, his bearing is composed, and when the festival begins and the gates open and the tarnish descends, the soldiers cheer for a mercy killing, for the death of the man they had pledged their lives to. They cheer because Radahn deserved witnesses who were glad he'd existed, and this was the only form their gladness could take. You descend the elevator. The arena opens up. The wailing dunes stretch in every direction, red and desolate, the air thick with the wrongness that Caelid specializes in. Your summon signs are in the sand, the other fighters who have gathered for the festival, waiting to join the battle alongside you. There is a strange lightness to the approach, a relief in having company in a world that is usually so solitary. And then the horizon changes. He comes from the distance, riding Leonard across the dunes, the size of him improbable and overwhelming. The twin greatswords, the red hair, the armour bearing the lion motif he chose for himself, weathered and broken and still, somehow, still recognisably his. He is enormous. He is horrifying. He is, in the truest and most painful sense of the word, diminished. The thing that comes across the dunes is not Radahn. It is what remains after Radahn has been consumed from the inside. The body is his. The power is still extraordinary. The person is gone. What the game is asking you to do, in the language of its design, is to understand both of these things simultaneously. The power and the absence. The body and the emptiness inside it. You are not killing a villain. You're not defeating an obstacle. You are completing an act of love that was started by people who could not finish it themselves, who needed someone capable of meeting Radahn at the level he deserved, who prepared the ceremony and summoned the witnesses, now need you to do the one thing they could not do, which is to be strong enough to end it well. The second phase is when the stars move. When you have brought him below half health, he leaps into the sky and transforms himself into a meteor, and the stars he arrested finally begin to move as his grip on them weakens, and he crashes back down to earth in an explosion of red light and rage. This is what power looks like when it has been stripped of purpose. The body of the mightiest demigod of the age, still fighting, still using the gravity magic he mastered to keep his horse, still swinging the swords he carried through the Shattering, and none of it means anything anymore because the person who gave those things meaning is gone. Miyazaki has said in interviews that the first Radahn encounter is his personal favourite boss fight in Elden Ring. Not the hardest, not the most mechanically complex, his favourite, because of the bitter-sweet tone, the scale of the arena and the sadness underneath it. The army of allies who fight alongside you and die repeatedly and are summoned again. Their loyalty to a dead man expressed through their willingness to keep returning to a fight that keeps killing them, until finally it is finished and the dunes are quiet and the stars are moving again. When he falls, Jeren's voice carries the specific exhaustion of completed grief. At last the war festival has ended. Brave champion, you have our gratitude. The celebration was spectacular. General Radahn is surely pleased. And then, quietly, the sentence that contains everything. Finally, my work is done. I am no longer bound to this fortress. He is released. The soldiers who remained are released. The thing they stayed for is finished. Leonard disappears from the arena, and Radahn, finally, after the rot and the waiting and the wasteland, is at rest. The immediate consequence of Radahn's death is astronomical, literally. The stars he held in place for years begin to move again the moment he dies. The celestial mechanics he arrested with his gravity magic resume their interrupted courses, and one star in particular, one that had been held directly above the lands between, falls. It falls into Limgrave, into the earth beneath the hills east of Stormhill. It crashes and burns and opens a hole in the world that descends into the underground realm, sealed from the surface since before the game's present. Nokron, the Eternal City, becomes accessible. This is not a minor event. Nokron is ancient, its residents possessing knowledge and items directly relevant to multiple questlines and endings. The Fingerslayer blade is there, the item that Ranni needs to proceed with her plan. Everything Ranni has been working toward requires the stars to move, which requires Radahn to die, which is why Bled and Alexander and everyone connected to the threads of fate that run through the game's best questlines were at the festival. Radahn's death releases his great rune, the fragment of the shattered Elden ring he had been carrying since the Shattering began. The great rune of Radahn is described as a rune of binding that draws the constellations to the wearer. It retains, even in its inert form after his death, the gravitational quality that defined his magic. The stars are still part of him, still drawn to what he was, even when he no longer exists to draw them. His soul goes to the land of shadow. In the lands between, death is not necessarily permanent. Miraca removed the rune of death from the Elden Ring, which means that the dead do not simply cease. They linger in various liminal spaces that the world provides for souls that have not been properly released. Radahn's soul, the compressed essence of the mightiest demigod of the age, went somewhere after the Tarnished struck him down in the Wailing Dunes. And Miquella knew where it would go, had planned for it to go there, had arranged the entire Battle of Aeonia and everything that followed so that this specific soul would be in this specific place, at this specific time, available for what Miquella needed to do next. The soldiers of Redmond Castle scatter after the festival. Jaren, released from his duty, says he has a task in mind, something personal, something he could not do while he was bound to the castle. The people who organised the most loving and most terrible thing Radahn's followers could have done for him are finally free to live whatever lives remain to them in a world changed by their general's death. Leonard disappears from the arena when Radahn dies. We do not know where he goes, whether he is still wandering the dunes of Caelid now that there is no longer a rider for him, whether the rot finally finished what the Battle of Aeonia started. Now that the strange suspended existence of Radahn's persistence is over, the game removes him, the way it removed Sif in Dark Souls, because the story of the Mount and the Rider was a single story, and both of its elements have concluded. What the world gained from Radahn's death was enormous in scope. What the world lost from Radahn's life was something smaller and harder to name. The stars moving again is a cosmic event, the festival being over is a human one, the soldiers dispersing is a human one, the fires that will no longer be kept burning in Caelid, the ones that served no purpose except to honour a man who could not know they were there, those going dark is a human one. This is what Elden Ring does better than almost any other game. It holds the cosmic and the human in the same frame simultaneously, without letting either overwhelm the other. The death of Radahn is a necessary act in the cosmic drama of Ranni's quest and Miquella's plan, and the movement of the stars. It is also the death of a man who loved a horse. it is also the conclusion of a long, terrible vigil by soldiers who refuse to leave. All of these things are true at the same time, and the game trusts you to hold all of them simultaneously without being told which one matters most. They all matter. The cosmic and the personal and the military and the equine. The man who stopped the stars and the man who would not leave his horse. They are the same person, and his death is the conclusion of everything he was, at every scale, simultaneously. What Radahn left behind in the world is a changed sky, an opened, underground city, a castle of scattered soldiers who loved him, a wasteland that still bears the mark of the most devastating thing that was done to him, and somewhere in the land of shadow, a soul that had stopped the stars and kept riding a small horse and asked for nothing except an honourable death, and a vow kept. The world moved on, the stars moved. Nokron opened. Ranni's quest continued, and Miquella waited, planning the next stage of the arrangement that had cost Radahn everything. Here is where the story gets complicated. Here is where the community fractured into positions still being debated. Here is where everything that came before, the gravity magic for the horse, and the stopped stars, and the vow, and the festival, and the honourable death, all of it gets placed under a new and deeply uncomfortable light. Miquella took Radahn's soul. This is what the Shadow of the Erdtree DLC is about at its core. Miquella, the most golden of Marika's children, the beloved half-god who put himself into a cocoon and sent his body to the land of shadow and stripped himself of everything divine so that he could become a true god by his own effort rather than by Marika's blessing, needed a consort. Every god needs a lord. This is the law of the world as Elden Ring presents it. Marika had Godfrey, then she had Radahn. The divine requires a counterpart, a grounding in martial power and earthly strength to balance the celestial authority of godhood. Miquella could not become a true god alone. He needed someone to stand beside him. He chose Radahn. We know from the lore that Radahn and Miquella had a vow from childhood. The specifics are never fully stated in either the base game or the DLC, but the DLC's item descriptions and dialogue fill in the outline. Miquella said that if Radahn upheld his vow, they would rule together in a world of peace. Radahn upheld his side by stopping the stars which halted Miquella's destiny, buying Miquella the time he needed to complete his plans without the interference of a fate he did not choose. And Miquella in return arranged for Radahn to be reborn in the land of shadow, not in the broken, rot-consumed body that had been wandering Caelid, but in a new form, restored, remade, in his prime. The body Miquella used was Mog's, the Lord of Blood, whose underground dynasty had been building towards some dark apotheosis that Miquella ultimately interrupted. Miquella took Mog's body and infused Radahn's soul into it, and what emerged was promised Consort Radahn, the final boss of the Shadow of the Erdtree expansion, widely considered the hardest challenge FromSoftware has ever put in front of players, and one of the most thematically complicated figures in the company's entire history. The question of consent is the question that will not let the story rest. Did Radahn agree to this? Did the vow between them include the understanding that his soul would be taken and placed in another person's body and made into a god's consort? Or did Miquella, whose power of compelling love has been exercised on multiple characters throughout the game, use that power to make Radahn consent to something that free will might not have chosen? The community is divided. Those who argue that Radahn consented point to the nature of the vow and the fact that stopping the stars was an act of extraordinary sacrifice, suggesting he was deeply invested in the partnership. They point to Miquella's stated desire for a world of peace, and argue that Radahn, who watched his land destroyed by war, might genuinely have wanted that world. Those who argue that Radahn did not fully and freely consent point to Miquella's power being explicitly described as a form of compulsion, that characters who fall under his influence lose something of their autonomy in ways they may not fully perceive. They point to Leonard's conspicuous absence in the DLC. In the base game, Leonard is always with Radahn. In the DLC, in the arena of the promised consort, Leonard is not there. The horse that Radahn learned gravity magic to keep, the companion that stayed with him through the rot and the madness and the wasteland, is absent from the moment that is supposed to be Radahn's fulfillment of the vow. This absence is either a failure of the design or a deliberate statement. If it is deliberate, what it says is devastating. The Radahn who would have wanted Leonard there is not the same as the being that inhabits the arena of the promised consort. Something is missing, and the missing thing is the most specifically Radahn thing about him. The love for a small horse that drove one of the most powerful beings in the world to years of dedicated magical study. Promised Consort Radahn fights differently from Starscourge Radahn. His first phase retains some of the gravity magic, the same stars and the same crushing momentum that made the original encounter so memorable. The twin greatswords are still there. The scale is still immense. In some ways, it feels like a recognition. The same fighter you knew in a different context. And then the second phase begins. But his second phase is holy. Miquella's light. Incandescent. Golden. The specific quality of radiance that belongs to the Erd Tree and the Golden Order and everything that Radahn, the lion who wore his red hair with pride and admired Godfrey rather than the gods, was never about. The second phase looks like a god. It does not look like Radahn. This is the final tragedy. The man who defined himself by refusing to be what others wanted him to be, who took the thing his father hated about him and made it his crown, who learned magic for a horse rather than for power, ends his story as someone else's idea of what he should be. Miquella's consort, a god's lord, a figure of golden radiance in a realm that Radahn never sought, and that has nothing to do with the red sands and the twin greatswords and the small horse on a battlefield. The community has noted that Promised Consort Radahn is widely considered one of the most difficult bosses in FromSoftware's history. This is not irrelevant to the lore. All that extraordinary power that made him the mightiest demigod of the age, now deployed entirely in service of someone else's purpose. The difficulty is the tragedy made mechanical. You are fighting everything Radahn was capable of, in the service of what Miquella needed him to be. Leonard's absence is the detail that matters most. In every encounter with Radahn in the base game, Leonard is there. Not fighting, not helpful, simply present, beside his lord, the way he was always beside his lord. And in the land of shadow, in the arena of the promised consort where Radahn is supposed to be fulfilling the vow that defined the second half of his life, Leonard is not there. The most specifically Radahn thing about him, the love that existed outside all the structures of power and divine inheritance, is absent from the moment that is supposed to be his fulfillment. Whether this was his choice or not, the ending is the same. Radahn, the champion's cub who became the lord of the battlefield's lion, rests in the land of shadow as part of a divine arrangement that was built around him without his full participation in its design. The stars that he stopped are moving again. Leonard is gone. The Redmane Knights are scattered. And somewhere in the golden light of a god's ambition, A man who once refused to abandon a horse is being asked to abandon everything that made him himself. We should spend a moment on the question of Miquella and whether what he did was wrong, because this question matters not just as lore, but as a moral statement, and Elden Ring is making a moral statement about Miquella through the design of the DLC and the nature of the final boss. Miquella is presented at first as the most sympathetic of Marika's children, the most beautiful, the most beloved, the god who wanted to create a world without hatred and suffering, who walked away from his divine inheritance to become something purer, who put himself through an extraordinary transformation because he believed the world could be better and was willing to pay any personal cost to make it so. He is genuinely appealing in the way that idealists are appealing before you have seen what they are willing to do in service of their ideal. What he was willing to do was compel. The DLC is full of characters who loved Miquella against their will or beyond what their nature would have chosen. Ansbach, his loyal valet, acknowledges that Miquella's influence went beyond ordinary devotion. Leader, the commander of his followers, operates with the fanatical certainty of someone whose love has been amplified past the point where it crowds out everything else. And Radahn, whose soul was taken from the Wailing Dunes and infused into another person's body at the direction of a half-god who'd arranged his death years earlier, represents the most extreme expression of Miquella's willingness to use the people who loved him as materials for his plan. Miquella stripped himself of his golden grace. He abandoned the divine protections that made him one of the most powerful beings in the world. He did this so that he could become a god through his own effort and love rather than through inheritance and power. The intention is beautiful. The execution is troubling. Because in stripping himself of his grace, Miquella did not strip himself of his power to compel. The force that makes people love him beyond what they would choose, that quality of divine beauty and golden warmth that draws everyone toward him, that he kept. He surrendered his power over the world and retained his power over people. There is an Elden Ring character named Teolia, who represents one of the most devastating expressions of what Miquella's love costs. Teolia devoted himself to Centrina, a figure connected to Miquella, and the devotion consumed him. He gave everything. He gave his health and his safety and his capacity for ordinary human happiness. And what he received in return was the specific kind of acknowledgement that Miquella gives, which is real and genuine and completely insufficient as compensation for what was taken. Miquella does not exploit out of malice. He exploits out of certainty. This certainty that his vision is worth the cost. This certainty that the people who love him will understand eventually why what was done to them was necessary. This is the oldest story in the world. The God who loves its creation too much to let the creation choose, the parent who sacrifices the child for the child's own good, the leader who compels the people because the people, left to their own choices, might choose the wrong thing. Miquella is not a villain. He's something more familiar and more disturbing. He is someone who is very certain that he is right. And Radahn, the man who made every choice in his life from a place of love rather than certainty, who learned magic for a horse and stopped stars for a vow and asked for nothing except to die as he had lived, deserved better than to be the materials for someone else's certainty. Every story is about something other than what it appears to be about. The surface of Radahn's story is demigods and rot and gravity magic and a horse with a name. The depth of it is something that connects to questions you carry outside of games, outside of fictional worlds, into the ordinary life that exists when the screen is off and the story has ended. Radahn is a story about loyalty, not the loyalty of the soldier to the general, though that is part of it. The loyalty of a person to the specific, irreplaceable things they love. Leonard is not a symbol. He is a horse. A scrawny, undersized, probably should have been replaced years ago horse that Radahn refused to leave behind because leaving him behind was not something Radahn was able to do. Not because of obligation or strategy or the calculation of what was practical. Because he loved the horse. The horse was his, and the things that are yours, in the deepest and most personal sense of that word, you do not abandon. This quality, this refusal to abandon what he loved, expresses itself at every scale of Radahn's story. The horse at the smallest personal scale, the vow with Miquella at the political and cosmic scale, the stars that he held fixed in the sky as the ultimate expression of his gravitational loyalty, his refusal to let the cosmos move in directions that would betray a promise he had made. He was the same person at every scale. What he valued in his stable he valued in the sky. The consistency is the character, and this is what makes the story of his end so devastating. The loyalty that defined him was ultimately used against him. Miquella understood, either through intuition or through the specific divine perception he possessed, exactly what Radahn was. He knew that if he made a vow with this particular man, the vow would be honoured. He knew that if he promised a world of peace to someone who had watched the Shattering destroy everything, that promise would mean something profound. He knew that Radahn's loyalty, once given, was absolute, and he used that knowledge to arrange the death and the soul transfer and the consort arrangement, because a man whose loyalty is absolute is a man who can be relied upon to hold up his end of any bargain you make with him. Radahn did hold up his end. He stopped the stars. He fought Malenia, and the rot consumed him, and he waited in the wasteland for the death he deserved. He upheld the vow in every way it was possible to uphold it, and in the final accounting, what he received in return was to have his soul placed in someone else's body and made into a god's consort in a realm he never sought, in a form that had nothing to do with the man who learned gravity magic for a horse. The comparison to Sif is the one that every person who has played both games reaches for, and it is the right comparison. Sif and Leonard are the same story at different scales. The companion who stays, the animal that does not leave when leaving, would be the rational choice, the love that persists past the point where persistence makes sense. The horse in the Wailing Dunes, carrying what remains of a man who once moved stars for him, is the same statement as the wolf in Darkroot Garden, guarding what remains of a knight who once protected her in the dark. Both are answers to the question of what loyalty looks like when it has outlasted its original context and become something purer and sadder and more true than it was when it was just a choice. But there is a difference too. Sif is protecting something. She guards the grave because the grave must be protected. Her loyalty has an object and a purpose, however abstract and however sad. Leonard's loyalty has neither. There is nothing to protect in the Wailing Dunes. There is nothing to guard. Radahn cannot be saved. The rot cannot be held back by the presence of a horse. Leonard stays not because staying does anything useful, not because the staying accomplishes any goal that could be articulated or measured. Leonard stays because Radahn is there. That is the entire reason. The most irreducible form of the thing. This is the detail that makes the image so unbearable to sit with. Not the giant on the small horse in general. That image on its own is striking and strange and memorable. It is the specific knowledge of why the horse is small. The knowledge that Radahn spent years in a sorcery school learning to make himself weightless, so that Leonard would not have to bear the burden of his size, and then looking at the two of them in the wasteland and understanding that the weightlessness is still there. Even now, even in the rot and the madness and the thing that Radahn has become, the gravity magic he learned for Leonard is still working. Leonard is still not carrying the full weight of what Radahn is, because Radahn, or whatever is left of Radahn, is still doing the thing he learned to do for the horse he loved. There is no one left to appreciate this. There is no conscious read-on to reflect on the fact that the magic is still working for the purpose he originally designed it for. There is only the hunger and the dunes and the horse beneath the hunger, still not carrying the full weight, because the body still knows what it was taught to do and has not been told to stop. You could write 100 pages about Radahn and never get further than this. The gravity magic still working for Leonard in the Wailing Dunes, the stopped stars, the festival that honoured him. These are the whole story. A man who used his power to hold on to the things he loved until the rot took his mind and left only the holding. Radahn asked for nothing. This is the thing about him that is the most quietly remarkable. He did not seek godhood. He did not seek the throne. He did not seek to rule the lands between or reshape its laws or impose his will on the world. He wanted to keep his horse. He wanted to honour a vow. He wanted to fight with honour and die with honour. These are small wants, human wants, on the scale of a person rather than the scale of a demigod. And the world, which had larger plans for him, did not have the grace to honour them. Think about what this means in the context of the Shattering. Radahn, who was by multiple accounts the most powerful demigod fighting in that war, the one whose participation most changed the shape of the conflict, did not fight because he was driven by the rune of ambition in the same way as the others. He fought because he had to, because the Shattering was happening around him, and his people needed him, and not fighting would have meant abandoning Redmane Castle and the soldiers who had given their lives to serve under him. His rune drove him toward the battle, but the man was still present enough to fight it his own way, with the dual swords and the gravity magic and the gravity that made Leonard weightless, with the specific combination of tools and style that was unmistakably his. He never grafted. This matters. The Shattering produced demigods who collected the power of others through increasingly disturbing means. Godric the Grafted ripped limbs from defeated enemies and attached them to his own body. Rickard consumed his followers. The drive to accumulate, to take the power of the defeated and add it to yourself, was one of the ways the madness of the rune expressed itself. Radahn did not do this. He fought with the weapons he had, and the power he had developed, and the skills he had learned, and he won most of what he fought, and the things he did not win, he lost the way that honourable fighters lose, by meeting something larger than himself and being unable to overcome it. The only thing that defeated him was the rot, and the rot came not through any choice of his own, but through someone else's plan, delivered by a blade he fought to a standstill in a battle he did not lose but could not win, whispered into his ear in the moment of mutual ruin. He was not brought down by hubris or corruption, or the specific character failures that undo most of the demigods in this game. He was brought down by love that was used as a weapon, by a vow that was honoured completely and returned incompletely, by the specific vulnerability of being someone who keeps his promises in a world of people who use the promises of others as tools. This is what Elden Ring is saying through Radahn, that even in a world of gods and cosmic stakes, the small things matter. The horse matters, the vow matters, the honour of a death that reflects the life that preceded it matters, and a world that cannot accommodate these small, human, deeply specific loyalties, a world that consumes them in service of something grander and more abstract and more certain of its own righteousness, is a world that has lost something it did not know it had until it was gone. The red hair that his father hated, the scrawny horse that any reasonable assessment would have replaced, the gravity magic learned for love rather than for war, the stars, held still not for power but for a promise. These are the things that made Radahn who he was, not the power, not the title, not the festival or the legend or the mightiest demigod of the Shattering, the small choices, the personal ones, the ones that cost him nothing except everything. Let us end where Radahn's story was most fully itself, not in the land of shadow, in the golden light of a god's ambition, not in the arena of the promised consort, in the second phase of a fight that has almost nothing to do with who he was. Let us end in Caelid, on the Wailing Dunes, where the rot turned the sand red, and the soldiers kept their fires burning, and Leonard carried his lord across the wasteland because that was the only thing left to do. The festival was a funeral. The greatest warriors of the age gathered not in triumph but in grief, dressed in the language of celebration because celebration was what he deserved and grief was what they had. They called it a war festival. They announced it with fanfare. They invited fighters and adventurers and a pot warrior and a half-wolf and a man with no scruples and a tarnished who stumbled into it by way of someone else's quest. And together they did the most loving and the most terrible thing that loyalty can do, which is to end a suffering that the sufferer can no longer end themselves. The thing about great love is that it requires you to be able to do this, to be able to hold someone close for years, and then, when holding close is no longer kindness, to let go. Jeren understood this. The Redmane Knights understood it. Leonard, in whatever way a horse can understand anything, understood it too. They stayed until the staying was over, and when the staying was over, they let go. Radahn stopped the stars. He rode a small horse across a battlefield where the most powerful beings in the world had been destroying each other. He was the mightiest demigod of the age, and he used his might to keep a promise, and protect a companion, and fight with honour and die with dignity. He did not win. He did not get the world of peace that Miquella promised. He did not get to grow old in whatever constitutes ordinary life for a demigod. He got the rot and the wasteland and the long terrible waiting, and finally a death that was at least witnessed by people who loved him. And Leonard. Leonard stayed. Through all of it. Through the rot and the madness and the thing that Radahn became when the person was gone and only the hunger remained. Leonard stayed because Radahn once decided, years before any of this happened, that he was not going to leave his horse behind. He was going to learn whatever he needed to learn, and do whatever he needed to do, and Leonard was going to keep moving through the world under him for as long as either of them existed. That decision, made by a young demigod in a sorcery school in Caelid before the wars and before the rot, echoed forward through everything. It expressed itself in the stopped stars and the vow and the festival. It ended on the red sands where the horse carried what remained of the man who had made it. There is a kind of love that does not compute, that refuses to run the numbers and arrive at the rational conclusion. Radahn could have replaced Leonard. The calculation was simple and the conclusion was obvious, and every practical consideration pointed in the same direction. Replace the horse. Radahn refused. The love did not compute. It persisted past the point where computation was relevant. past the point where the relationship made any sense in terms of advantage or convenience, or the strategic management of his resources. It persisted because it was love, and love does not ask whether it is practical. Leonard's persistence in the wasteland is the mirror of this. There was nothing Leonard could do for Radahn anymore. Radahn could not know Leonard was there. Radahn could not receive comfort from the companionship of the horse because there was no longer a Radahn to be comforted. And Leonard stayed anyway, carrying the body, enduring the rot, moving across the dunes because that was what they did, because moving together was the shape of their existence, and the shape of their existence had not changed even though everything that gave it meaning had. This is what Elden Ring is telling you through the image of the giant on the small horse in the wasteland. Not something about power, not something about war or legacy or the ambitions of gods and demigods. Something about the thing that survives after everything else is stripped away. The thing that persists when the person is gone and the horse is all that remains and the rot is everywhere, and there is no reason to keep going except the reason you had before all of this happened, which was simply that this is the person you chose and you are not going to leave them. FromSoftware labelled the model Radahn and Leonard. They knew. The developer knew that the story was one story in two bodies, and that it ended when both of them ended, and that ending it any other way would have been a lie. There are things in stories that you carry with you, not the plots, not the mythologies, specific images that stay in the mind long after the narrative has faded. For Dark Souls it is a wolf in a foggy garden, guarding a grave that contains a lie and a truth. For Elden Ring it is a giant riding a small horse across a wasteland, both of them infected with the same rot, both of them diminished beyond what either of them was, still together, still moving, because one of them, a long time ago, decided that abandoning the other was not something he was going to do. The red sands are quiet now, the stars are moving, the festival is over, and somewhere in the story that this game tells about what it means to love something and refuse to let it go, there is a horse with a name and a man who learned gravity magic to keep riding him, and the two of them are the whole point of everything. There is something worth saying before we end. The story of Radahn and Leonard is not exceptional in the landscape of great love stories. It is not more dramatic than Romeo and Juliet, or more cosmic than stories of gods and their chosen. What makes it exceptional is its specificity. It is not a story about love in the abstract. It is a story about a specific love, a specific horse, a specific choice made by a specific person on a specific day in a sorcery school in Caelid, before the wars, before the stars stopped, before any of the tragedy that followed had been written. He looked at his horse and he decided. That is the whole origin. A decision, a refusal. A young demigod who is going to become something extraordinary and who, in the middle of becoming it, stopped to make sure that the thing that mattered most to him personally, not cosmically, not politically, not strategically, was taken care of. Every great love story is really a story about a decision, not the decision to fall in love, which is not really a decision at all, the decision to stay, the decision to keep organizing the world around a specific person when every other consideration would suggest you should organize it differently. Radahn made that decision about a horse, and he kept making it through the gravity magic and the stopped stars and the wars and the rot, until the person capable of making decisions was gone, and all that remained was the decision itself, still working, still holding, still making the horse weightless in a wasteland where nothing else was right. I want to tell you something before we close. Elden Ring is a game that can feel overwhelming in its scope. The world is enormous, the lore is dense, The number of characters and factions and interconnected storylines can make it feel like you need a guide and a spreadsheet just to understand what is happening. And all of that is true. But underneath all of it, underneath every great rune and every demigod and every ancient rite and every piece of golden machinery that the game puts in front of you, there is this. A man who learned gravity magic for a horse that stayed when there was nothing left to stay for. Two beings who found each other and refused to let the world come between them, even at the end, even in the rot, even in the wasteland where the end had already come and they were simply finishing the journey together. That is what stories are for. Not to explain the complicated, to remind you of the simple. That love, in its most specific and personal and irreplaceable form, is the thing that persists. That the things worth holding on to are the things you chose, not the things assigned to you by destiny or inheritance or the will of gods. That the gravity magic is always in service of the horse, that the stars were stopped for the vow, that the festival was a funeral organised by people who could not bear to let a great man die like a monster, and that somewhere, in the red sands of a ruined land, a horse carried something it loved to the end of what either of them had. Because that is what you do when you love something. You carry it, as far as you can, until you cannot, and then you stop together. Thank you for spending this long night with Nightfall lore. If the story carried you to sleep, then it did what it was meant to do. And if you are still awake, still here on the red sands with the horse and the stopped stars, know that I am grateful for your company tonight and always. There is one more thing I want to say. The story of Radahn is not over. FromSoftware will make more games. The lands between and everything in it may or may not continue. But this specific story, the one about the man who stopped the stars for a horse and a vow, and got the rot and the wasteland and a death that was at least witnessed with love, that story is finished. It has an ending, and the ending is not the promised consort or the golden light of Miquella's ambition. The ending is in the wailing dunes, on the red sand, when the dunes go quiet and the stars begin to move and Leonard disappears, because there is nothing left to carry and nowhere left to go. And the story that was always one story in two bodies concludes in the same breath. That is enough. That is the whole thing. A man, a horse, the gravity magic learned for love, the stars stopped for a promise, the festival that was a funeral, the red sands, quiet now. Subscribe if you have not already, leave a like if the story moved you, and rest well, wherever you are. The stars are moving again. That is enough. Good night.